What a great old building. I'd love to meet the people who built this. Hello, my name is George Walker, and I'll be your host as we explore traditional furniture design. The foundation for good design actually begins with architecture. The same principles that help create this colonial meeting house can be applied to a table, or a sideboard, or a dresser. Let's go back to my drafting table and we'll begin. This happens all the time at my house. My wife will tear a page out of a magazine and she'll say to me, "George, when are you going to get around to building that bureau you've been promising for the foyer? I love this piece. Can you make it just like this?" And I'll start thinking about that walnut I've got stored down in the basement when she comes back with, "But I'd like it a little shorter, and I think I'd like it a little wider, and the feet, I don't like these feet. Can we change the feet? And I'd like it made out of cherry." Does that sound familiar? Well, I can't help with the cherry versus walnut thing, but I can help with the part of the request for the shorter, wider, narrower, deeper, plainer, fancier part of the request. Perhaps you're a professional woodworker looking for a way to stand out in the crowd. Design skills can definitely set your work apart. You may have just learned a new skill, such as inlay or carving, and are eager to see where you can go with it. Above all, design can be fun. There's nothing quite like seeing your own designs come to life at your workbench. Just how do we learn design? Even those who seem to have a knack for it often have a difficult time explaining it. If you take the time to question any woodworker who has a talent for design, a few things seem to bob to the surface. They tend to be good observers. They may have handled a lot of high-quality antique furniture, or they enjoy observing nature, or they have an artistic bent and like studying a good painting. What all this means is that somehow they have trained their eye. That's what this video is really all about. Training the eye. But what's that about, training the eye? Do we have to lift barbells with our eyelids? Gaze at the Mona Lisa? Actually, training the eye is nothing more than building up a library in your mind. What sort of things go in this library? Models. Models are ideal images or forms from nature, art, architecture, and from masterful furniture work handed down to us. We use these models in our mind to help guide, inspire, and develop our ability to design. We'll explore models that have stood the test of time and have inspired artisans for centuries. One of the most exciting things about this traditional approach is that it offers a solid foundation regardless of whether you like modern work or more traditional forms. We're privileged to share with you the artistry of two outstanding Maine woodworkers. Jerry Curry draws from a deep knowledge of traditional forms to create stunning modern designs. This Newport tea table is the work of Al Breed, who runs a woodworking school in South Berwick, Maine. The work speaks for itself. America has a rich woodworking heritage. The 18th and early 19th century is often called the golden age of American furniture. Cabinet makers had fine lumber in unmatched supply from the forests of North America and the Caribbean. Hand tools reached new levels of refinement and accuracy. Finally, artisans spoke a common design language. This design language has its roots in the classic architecture of ancient Greece and Rome. It provided a framework for many crafts and styles. And here's an example in Pemaquid, Maine. I love this building, built in 1772. The austere exterior of the Harrington Meeting House belies a treasure of design within. The artisans that sculpted this interior were fluent in this traditional design language. They created a striking visual feast. Your eye cannot help but be drawn to the pulpit. It actually takes conscious effort to look away. The question begs an answer. How did they create such beauty? They achieved this without anything close to what we today consider a blueprint. One senses that anything added or removed would only detract. This design language they worked in had a few themes that we'll explore together. They had a deep knowledge of proportions and how to create visual harmony. They also knew how to work with forms. Forms are simple shapes used alone or in combination to create a visual effect. They often borrowed forms from the past or from nature. They also studied an ancient design form known as the classic orders. This striking doorway is an early American example of a classic order. The artisans who created this were so familiar with classical elements that they felt free to experiment and play. But they still have all the elements here. It starts with a plinth at the base, and then a fluted pilaster, which is a representation of a column, followed by a capital and then an entablature with some bold molding. The classic orders could be used to organize a design. We will learn more about this later in this video. The old masters held that beauty is achieved when a form is linked together in a harmony of proportions. We will begin by exploring form and proportions. A form is nothing more than a combination of simple shapes that combine into the visual skeleton of a design. When people talk about the lines of a piece, they're really talking about the form. It's that first visual impact you see when you see something from across the room. When my wife tears that page from a magazine and says, "George, when are you going to make this for me? I really love it," she's really saying, "I like this form." This is an excellent example of a form. Here's a tiger maple secretary I built. It's actually a combination of several different pieces, but it still stays true to the form. The overall form is defined by a large 2-to-1 rectangle around the perimeter of the piece. If we go down to the bottom of the form, it has a clear beginning with these OG bracket feet. Above that is a lower case. It's a square. The square isn't immediately apparent to the eye because it's broken up by several smaller elements. You've got these graduated drawers, each one a little shorter as it goes up to draw the eye up. And finally, that square is broken up by the desk lid. Above that is another simple rectangle with a ratio of 5:6. It's highlighted by these raised panel doors, which also draw the eye up to the tombstone arch. Actually, the tombstone arch is inspired by the Roman arch. Finally, the form is terminated by the cornice, providing a clear ending to the form. When we talk about training the eye, we are really referring to the ability to recognize and work with forms. It is the ability to look past the surface and see the simple squares, circles, or rectangles that together catch the eye. The point is, a form is a starting point, a solid place to begin. Let's take a look at a simple form, a bureau. My wife said she wants it about this high and a little wider than it is tall. So we'll start with a rectangle. Now, we'll start with a base. You want to get those drawers up off the floor. Nobody likes to pull a drawer out and have it scrape the bottom of their feet. And nobody wants to bend all the way down to the floor to get something out of the bottom of a drawer. So we've got those drawers up off the floor. Now we need a top. It's sort of a table that we can use to throw our hat and keys. And then finally, we're going to connect that base and that top with some sides. Up to now, we've only addressed function, with no mention of proportions, but proportions is what really ties this form together. The height of this base is not random, but rather is proportioned to enhance the overall height of the piece. It's also important to know that this form doesn't lock us into one style or fashion. If we wanted to, we could put a traditional OG bracket foot here, or in this same envelope, we could place a kind of a more modern geometric foot, or we could take it a completely different direction. We could kind of go a little bit organic here with some kind of tree roots coming up out of the ground in this same little envelope. The same goes for the top. We could lay in a very traditional molded edge with a solid wide plank, or in that same envelope, if we wanted to, for that matter, we could lay a granite top on there. There's many possibilities of what we can do with this form. You aren't even confined to a rectangular shape in this form. Once it's roughed in, you can add curvature. Curvature adds a powerful dimension to a design, partly because it evokes forms from nature that we relate to, but more so because how it reacts with light. A flat surface reflects light in a single monotone. Make that surface concave, and we have an area of maximum shadow that fades back into light. Make it convex, and we have an area of maximum reflection that fades back into shadow. Combine the concave and the convex, and you have a dance of light that goes from shadow gradually back into reflection and into shadow again. Traditional work often uses curves to exploit this dramatically. That's one of the reasons seeing period furniture in person is so much more compelling than just seeing an image in a book. These functional areas are important framing elements in the design. They're proportioned to enhance the entire form. If we make them too small, the design comes off weak, sort of refrigerator-like. Conversely, if we make them too large, the design comes off clumsy or clownish. Now let's turn our attention to proportions. Proportion at its simplest is how one part relates to another and how it relates to the whole. Proportion is used to create a unity in a design. There's basically three things that you can do with proportion. If I divide this into half, I create an equality or a symmetry. I can also create contrast by breaking this into different lengths. Finally, we can create punctuation. Punctuation is used to create a clear border or distinct beginning and ending. Let's move on to symmetry. Symmetry is frequently used in the layout of a facade. If you draw a vertical center line up through the middle of the piece, you will note a mirror image on either side. This center line is called a line of recall. The image on one side recalls the other. Again, this is often observed in nature. A human figure has a mirror image left and right side. Typically, symmetry is used to lead the eye to a focal point. However, usually in traditional design, we avoid symmetry north and south of a horizontal line. This takes the eye nowhere. I call this avoiding the file cabinet look. Here is a drawing made by a cabinet maker in Philadelphia circa 1760 of a chest on chest. If you draw a vertical center line, the symmetry is obvious. Also, it avoids the file cabinet look by graduating the drawers. Each drawer is slightly shorter than the one below it for both the upper and lower cases. When the Romans invented concrete and began building multi-story buildings like the Colosseum, they made each story slightly shorter as it rose up. Just like the graduations in these drawers, it draws the eye up. Notice also that the upper and lower cases are not the same. They contrast. The form uses different size shapes to create a hierarchy. Symmetry can also be expressed in simple shapes. All points on a circle are equally distant from the center. The circle or sphere is at the top of the hierarchy of symmetrical shapes, and the ancients thought the circle a symbol of perfection. It has no beginning and end. The square is the counterpart to the circle, all sides being equal. In many cases, a circle or square is interchangeable as a simple shape in a design. Circles appear frequently in the natural world around us. This drawing of the Vitruvian Man by Leonardo is actually a design study on the perfection of the ideal human form superimposed on the two perfect shapes, the circle and square. It should come as no surprise that many traditional forms are often anchored by a circle or square. You may recognize this building as the Rotunda on the campus of the University of Virginia. It was designed by Thomas Jefferson. He based this on the 2nd century Pantheon in Rome. It is essentially a circle with the building sides forming a cylinder from the equator to the base. Let's look now at a couple of furniture examples. Look again at the Philly chest on chest. The bottom case is defined by a square. This square may be further broken into base and drawer spaces, but the form is driven by a square. Notice how the center section is defined by a square in this Federal era sideboard. We can also use proportion to create difference or contrast. In this case, I divide this board into a simple ratio of 2 to 3. I can take my dividers and just show that. We have 2 parts to 3 parts. Even though we've broken these into a major and a minor, the major doesn't dominate the minor. Rather, minor complements major. One completes the other, or they harmonize. Traditional design leans heavily on the use of simple whole number ratios. I'd like to tell you a story about the origins of simple whole number ratios. Pythagoras, a Greek mathematician from antiquity, is credited with laying the foundation for proportions. Legend holds that Pythagoras was walking by a blacksmith shop while 2 smithies worked on separate anvils. By chance, both struck their anvils at the same moment. The hammers produced a sound that stopped Pythagoras dead in his tracks. He just had to investigate. What he found was one anvil twice as large as the other. The sound that captivated his ear was an octave. Pythagoras went on to build a crude stringed instrument to explore the link between music and mathematics. He discovered that when strings with simple whole number ratios were plucked together, they produced pleasing tones. The difference in tone between 2 strings with a ratio of 1 to 2 is an octave. 2 to 3, a fifth. 3 to 4, a fourth. And so on. This became the basis for Western tonal music we still enjoy today. These simple ratios were held to be superior and spilled over into the visual arts. Renaissance designers were fond of the phrase, "Proportions are to the eye what music is to the ear." Many of the early books on design had lists of simple shapes favored for building. They usually started with a circle and a square, and then a series of simple rectangles from there, starting with the square, which is a ratio of 1 to 1, a rectangle with a ratio of 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, 3 to 5, and 4 to 5. Now I've just arranged these in a mathematical sequence. Now I'd like to take a moment and rearrange them in a visual sequence. If you place a line across here, it's obvious that these are all a square plus a fraction of a square. We're starting with a ratio of 1 to 1, which is 1 square, and a ratio of 1 to 2, which is 2 squares. And in between, we have a square plus a fraction. A ratio of 4 to 5 is a square plus a quarter. 3 to 4 is a square plus a third. 2 to 3 is a square and a half. 3 to 5 is a square plus 2/3 square. And finally, this 1 to 2 is 2 squares. Knowing that these simple shapes are either multiples or fractions of squares makes it quite easy to pull the ratios out of those shapes with a set of dividers. You can take a set of dividers and set it to the width to find your square, and then set another set of dividers to the fraction and use that to step off the ratio. In this case, we have a ratio of 3 to 2. After you've done this exercise a few times, your eye will be able to pick up these ratios at a glance. This is part of training the eye. Now let's go take a look again at that federal sideboard. The outer boundary of the piece is a 2-to-1 rectangle. The central square is flanked on both sides by 2 rectangles, which are also a ratio of 2 to 1. Those are then divided again into a 4-to-5 rectangle, which defines the open space below the case, and a 3-to-4 rectangle that defines the upper portion. Back to the Philadelphia chest on chest. A 2-to-1 rectangle defines the overall form. The upper case is a 2-to-3 rectangle that is bounded by the top of the pediment, the division between the cases, and the inside of the drawer openings. Now we come to one of the most important uses of proportion in traditional design, punctuation. Punctuation is created when one part dominates the other. We use punctuation to create visual borders or a strong beginning and ending to a design. Visually, a strong beginning and ending has great appeal to our eyes. We are just wired that way. Imagine trying to read a book where the pages have no margin, but the text runs from one edge of the page to the other and top to bottom. The eye instantly rebels. The eye does not like to run off a cliff at the edge of the page and chafes at having to jump back onto the edge to continue reading the next line. This is why we use margins on text or a picture frame around a painting. There's a functional reason for beveling the edge of a raised panel so it'll fit in this door frame. But this beveled edge also works as a border that subtly pulls your eye into the bold grain in the middle of the panel. The same effect can be achieved with a border of marquetry that will also pull your eye into the center panel. When we recognize a piece of furniture from across the room, it's often the molding that catches our eye and pulls it across the form. Period woodworkers recognized this and exploited it. During much of the 18th century, they used bold architectural moldings and carving to act as borders. Later, when the federal style replaced carving with veneers, inland marquetry were employed as borders to achieve the same effect. This is a classic order. It's one of the most important design models. The orders began as architectural forms in the construction of temples. First the Greeks, then the Romans elevated the form. There are 5 classic orders, 3 of which are used most often in furniture design. This is a Doric classic order. 2 others, the Ionic and Corinthian, are recognized by their distinct capitals. They each have a unique character, but basically they cover a range from stocky to slender and a range of decoration from austere to sumptuous. Each also has its own inherent proportional scheme. Although the orders began as a structural form, over time they evolved into a proportional system that's used to organize a design. What exactly do we mean by organizing a design? In a traditional sense, that means giving a design a distinct beginning, middle, and ending. We can see that plainly in this Doric classic order. The pedestal is the beginning of the form. It also punctuates everything that's above it. Above that is the column. That's the middle of this form. This area above here is known as the entablature. The entablature terminates the form or provides a clear ending. It also punctuates everything that's below it. Now this theme of beginning, middle, and ending repeats itself in smaller elements within the form. Back at the pedestal, it has a base, a die, and a small cornice, a beginning, middle, and ending. The base punctuates what's above, the cornice punctuates what's below. The column has a base, shaft, and capital, a clear beginning, middle, and ending. Now let's take a look at a few practical ways that the classic orders were used in design. Let's begin with a bare wall and insert an imaginary Doric order between floor and ceiling. Elements from the order are then used to control the design of the wall. The baseboard corresponds to the molding at the base of the pedestal. The chair rail shadows the cornice at the top of the pedestal. The height of the window opening corresponds to the column height. The crown molding at the top of the wall is sized from the cornice at the top of the entablature. Finally, the casing that surrounds the window is plucked from the architrave. The architrave is the horizontal band that rests directly on the capital. You can remove the order, but it's really still there. At least its shadow is there once your eyes know what to look for. Now, artisans didn't go around drawing the classic orders on walls. The orders are made up of simple and elegant proportional schemes. If I'd like to find the height of the pedestal, I simply divide the height of the whole order into 5 equal units, and the bottom fifth equals the height of the pedestal, the beginning, the punctuation of the form above it. If I'd like to find the height of the entablature, I simply take the space above the pedestal and I divide it by 5 again, and the top fifth equals the height of the entablature, the ending or the termination of the form. Thus, this entire order, the major parts of it, can be arrived at by simple divisions of 5. Generally, for all the orders, the pedestal is the entire height divided by 5. The entablature for the Ionic and Corinthian is more slender and is achieved by dividing into 6. These ratios used to punctuate are generally made by dividing a space by 5 or 6 and using the top or bottom unit to establish a beginning or ending. Towards the end of the 18th century, designers favored more slender designs. Sometimes they divided a space by 7. On our sideboard, divide the overall height by 5, and you get the height of the drawer that caps the central section. Let's look at our chest on chest. If we divide the height of this bottom case by 5, the bottom fifth lines up with the feet. You can think of them as taking the role of little pedestals, a clear beginning for the bottom case. If you superimpose a small classic order, you can see this clearly. Divide the entire height into 6 equal units. Look how the top sixth corresponds with the pediment. Although this is very simple, this method of applying the orders can offer many practical design options. Here is a profile for a crown molding used on top of a case. Divide the height by 5 and see how the bottom section aligns with the bottom fifth. Divide by 5 again and see how the width of the top quarter round and fillet is determined. Thus, even for this small composition within a larger design, we have created a beginning, middle, and ending. I've had a lot of fun studying this Newport tea table. One of the first things that caught my eye was it looked as though this apron was based on the proportions in a classic order. My eye said it's probably a ratio of 1 to 5. So I made up a scale to see based on the entire height of the table. It's not exactly a perfect match, but it's so close it leaves little doubt as to what inspired the design. Also, when I look at this molding on the top of this table apron, it also looks like one of those punctuating ratios. And if you divide the height of that by 6, it matches right up with that molding. Again, this tabletop punctuates the apron below it. A few more things jumped out at me when I looked at this thing. This gorgeous sculpted top, it's based on some sort of rectangle. So I pulled the measurements off the corners of the legs, a major structural element, and it's a beautiful 3 to 5 rectangle. Also, across the front of the facade, going from the top of this leg to the floor and across the corners, we have a beautiful rectangle that's 4 parts to 5 parts. If I look at these curved elements on the end of the facade that goes into this table leg, and I divide this element into 3 parts, this flat part is 1 part, and this curved element is 2 parts. If I compare this element to this flat section in the center, it's a ratio of 3 to 4. So we've got this little proportional kind of music going on here where it goes 3 parts to 4 parts, back to 3 parts. I was stunned when I first saw this table in person, and as I look at it closer, it continues to fascinate me. We're only scratching the surface on the classic orders, but there's a few more points I'd like to make that apply to furniture design. This is an entablature on top of this Doric order, and it contains several horizontal bands that can be used to size border elements in a design. This top horizontal band is the cornice, and it can be used to size a crown molding. This middle horizontal band is called the frieze. It's a flat panel that normally contains some sort of carving or decoration. Finally, on the bottom is the architrave. Think of this as the beam that spans between the columns and supports the rafters on a building. In traditional architecture, often an entablature would go across the doorway to highlight a prominent opening. Often, this architrave would go across the top of the door and then down the side as a border element. Now, although it looks a bit complex, it's actually put together with some very simple proportional schemes. If I'd like to find the height of this architrave, it's just a simple matter of dividing the entablature into 4 equal parts. The bottom fourth equals the architrave. If I'd like to find the height of this cornice, again, just a simple division. I take the height from the architrave on up, divide that in half. The top half is the cornice. Obviously, the bottom half would be the frieze. Thus, I can define this entire design element with just a couple simple divisions. I've also included in the glossary of this video drawings of the other classical orders and the proportional schemes that control them. In traditional design, it's very common to see ratios of 1 to 5 or 1 to 6, dividing an element into 5 or 6 parts. So I made up this little tool to help in that. It helps you to be able to pick this off of a drawing and also can be used when you're trying to actually draw something, an original drawing. It saves you from having to step everything off with dividers. What you do is you take a piece of paper, and on one side you just find the midpoint, and on the other side take a set of dividers, and in this case we're just stepping this off into 5 equal units. Connect those dots for the 5 spaces, and then what I like to do just to make the thing more visible is I'll color in every other space so it creates sort of a grid, and in this case this is 5 equal units. I also usually make one up that's divided into 6 equal units, and in that case I'll color every other one red so I can tell the difference between the ones that are 6 or 5ths. Just take a pair of scissors, cut it into strips so that you've got these little graduated kind of measuring tools. The way this is used is when, let's say I want to find out what the relation of this base is to this lower case, I can come over here and I can lay this on a bias with one end down at the floor and the other end where the cases come together. And you can see that where this grid intersects, it lines right up with where the base meets the case. So that tells me that this base is 1/5 of this lower case. That's a really handy way to smoke that out. Not only is this good for detecting this in a drawing, it's also good when you want to go the other way and make a drawing. I've got a little kit that I put together when I go to a museum, and I include some of these strips. It helps to put together a quick drawing in a museum setting. Let's explore a form. This is a good exercise to train your eye as you explore a great piece of furniture. Now, the ideal would be to study original pieces, but few have that luxury. A good substitute is to get a photocopy of an image of a piece that you like and explore it with a pair of dividers. Now, photographs can have some distortion, but it's surprising how much you can learn from them. And also, this isn't rocket science. We're not taking measurements down to 3 decimal points. We're trying to find the major design blocks in a piece of furniture that catches your eye from across the room. That's what we're looking for. Let's look again at that chest on chest. This is a really fun image to explore because it's a copy of an original drawing from the period. Very few of those have survived. I like to begin by laying in a few reference lines. I'll start with a line where the base meets the floor, and then a few horizontal lines at major transition points, like where the base meets the lower case, where the two cases come together, the top of the cornice, and finally the top of the pediment. I'll also lay a line of recall, or a vertical center line, up through the middle of the piece. Now from there, we're ready to start picking dimensions off of this thing. Remember that we're looking for the major building blocks behind the design. And I like to think about things that would have meaning to a cabinet maker, the boundaries that he would build something around, like the division between the cases, or the outer boundaries of a case. So let's just begin by taking and picking off this dimension between where the cases come together and the floor. And let's see if we can find anything. Well, if I go up here, that doesn't look like it's really anything, but how about, well, look at this. The inside of the lower case drawer openings is the exact same dimension as it is from where the cases come together to the floor. That tells me that right here I've got a one-to-one square, or a sphere for that matter, that's anchoring this bottom case. And then that kind of logically tells me, well, maybe there's more proportions built around the inside of this case. Let's take a look up at this upper case. On this upper case, I'm just going to divide this in half just to get a unit to work with. And so I've got this two units wide. Let's go up to the top of the pediment and see where that takes us. 1, 2, 3. Wow, is that cool. We've got a 2 to 3 rectangle that's bounded by the top of the pediment where the cases come together, and the inside of the case on the upper case. I also like to pluck the dimension off the outer boundary of the cases. Very often this is going to have a key to one of these major building blocks in this design. So let's just grab the outside of this bottom case and see if there's anything I can find. No, that doesn't tell me anything. Oh, look at that. There's a nugget. Where the bottom case meets the top, up to the top of this cornice, is the same width as this lower case. Let's come to the top of the pediment and go down and see if there's anything we can find there. Look at that. It comes down to the bottom of the bottom case. That tells me I've got a 2 to 1 rectangle that's defined by the outside of this bottom case and going from the bottom of here up to the top of the pediment. Really, right there, we've defined the major building blocks of this case: a square, a 2 to 3 rectangle, and an overall 2 to 1 rectangle from the top to the bottom. Now that we've discovered the major shapes that make up this form, we're going to move from those bigger elements down to the smaller detail. Let me take my dividers and let's grab this dimension from the floor to where the case meets the base. And I'm going to come up here and look at this upper drawer here in the top of the upper case. That's the same height. Ah, there's a gem. That's pretty neat. And notice that these 3 drawers up here, they're actually different lengths. These 2 on the side are shorter than this one in the middle. Here, let's see what we've got here. We've got 2, and if I come over here to this middle drawer, I've got 1, 2, 3. So we've got a ratio of 2 to 3, and then back to 2. In a piece of furniture like this, it's often common to be able to find many of these proportional relationships. And when you're looking for these things, if you're coming up with ratios that are like 11 to 13, you're making this too complicated. The ratios should be simple: 1 to 2, 3 to 4, maybe a 4 to 7, but not anything that goes beyond what you can count on your fingers. I would encourage you to study numerous pieces of period furniture. It'll really help you develop your eye. Let's work up a design together. It starts with an idea. In my case, it's my wife asking for that bureau for the foyer. She wants it about this tall and a little wider than it is tall. That's a good starting point. At this point, dimensions don't mean a whole lot, except for I know it needs to be about 34 inches tall, and it'll be a rectangle because it's wider than it is tall. Remember that form we roughed in earlier? Let's start with that. First, let's take a look at the proportions that make up this simple form that we have roughed in. It's bounded by a rectangle, and we've made it up of a rectangle that is a ratio of 5 parts to 4 parts. 2, 3, 4. Now that that's established, we've got a base, top, and sides. How did we get there? Well, these are actually plucked right off of a classic order. You can see readily that this base corresponds with a pedestal on a classic order. Now, how do you get to that pedestal? We talked about that earlier. It's just a simple division of 5. Divide this entire height into 5 parts. That gets me my envelope for the base. From here, the other parts of the top and the sides are actually plucked off of this entablature at the top of the classic order. The top corresponds with the cornice, and then the sides, I actually took those off of the architrave. That's this bottom element on the entablature, and often this was on top of a doorway and would wrap around the side of a door as used as a framing element. And that's where I took this side proportion. Now, again, these are actually pretty simple to get to. First, we have to establish the entablature itself. And again, that's just a simple division of 5 to get to the entablature. From there, we want to get to a couple of these little sub-elements. And we'll start with going to the architrave, that side element. To get to that, once we've established the entablature, that's just a simple division of 4. From there, I can pluck that dimension and then use that to establish this side framing element. Finally, to get to the cornice, it's just simply a matter of dividing that remaining space by 2, and that establishes the cornice on the top. We've now laid in the major framing elements of this piece. From here, we'll flesh this out. And just for fun, I'd like to divide this drawing in half, and on one side we'll put together a traditional bureau design, and over on the far side, using those same proportions, I'll work up a modern studio design. So here we're going to just divide this in half. And then from here, let's go ahead and fill in the detail on this top. Now, one of the things I like to start with is I'm drawing this third scale, so I'd like to set up a line that corresponds with the thickness of a one-board top. In this case, it would be like 7/8 of an inch. So I scaled this set of dividers that would correspond with the thickness of a full plank on here. And that's a pretty important line because my molding is going to correspond to that. So I'm going to draw that in here. Now the next thing I want to turn to is how far this top is going to extend beyond the sides of the case. And for that, I'll just use the height of the cornice. I'll set a compass to that. And we'll come over here and we'll just set how far we're going to overhang. Just a little reference mark. We'll do something fairly simple for this top. We're going to just come over here. We're going to extend out, come down with a fillet and a little ovalo. And let's draw a little shadow line in here. From here, I want to put a cove in to transition the bottom of this back to my case. And I'll just freehand this in. And now another little line for the edge of that cove. Let's darken this up. Finally, a reveal. just below the molding so my drawers aren't rubbing on that molding. And that's complete. Now let's turn our attention over to the other side, the studio piece. Now studio furniture or modern furniture may tend to be a little more streamlined. So I'm going to start with just pulling the line over for that one board top. We're still going to use a nice thick top. As far as the overhang of that cornice, or the overhang of this top, we're still going to use the cornice from the classic order. We're going to take the kind of same dimension, so I'm going to pick that off of the height here and come over here, and this will tell me how far my top's going to extend out to. Just a little reference line. This is a bit simpler, but we're going to let some colored woods kind of talk on this side of it versus some bold moldings. And over here, I think I'll just lay in a nice little radius, kind of freehand. I'll also take that line of reveal all the way across that I started on the other side. And that's the detail for that side for the top. Now let's turn our attention to the base. I'm going to add an OG bracket foot here, and I'm going to do this without any specific dimensions. Just using dividers, I can detail all the elements in this little form based on simple proportions. Start with, we're going to take this space for this base, and we're going to punctuate it. We're going to divide it into 6, and this is going to define where the molding is at the top of this base. In this case, we're going to include the molding in this base area. So I'm just going to extend a horizontal line over here, and this will establish between my base and my foot. And I want to know how far that molding is going to extend out, and generally on this stuff it extends out at a 45-degree angle, so that's fairly easy to establish just by dropping a 45 down. That's how far my molding will extend down. Now the base itself, it sits in an envelope that's a 2-to-1 rectangle, and it extends out beyond this molding 1/3 of a square. We know that a 2-to-1 rectangle is 2 squares, so to get 1/3 of a square, we just take dividers down and divide by 3, and I can then use that to mark up the outer envelope that this base sits in. Here's how far the foot's going to extend. Since it's a 2-to-1 rectangle, it's very easy to then know how far it's going to extend in by, again, pulling off that one side, and I can just come down here. Now here's the inner boundary of the foot. Now I've just established this little form that we're working with for this OG bracket foot as far as the rectangle that kind of governs it. Here's the inner boundary, and here's the outer boundary right here, this 2-to-1 rectangle. Now again, we're going to come back and we're going to punctuate this again. We're going to divide this area into 5 spaces to establish the pad for the bottom of the foot. It sits on a little pad with a couple of fillets. So we'll just divide that by 5. And now we're establishing a little envelope for that pad itself. To establish the width of that pad, how far it extends in, I'm going to divide this 2-to-1 rectangle again by 5 longitudinally, and 2/5 of the way in, you can see there I'm going from end to end. I'll mark a little line, or a mark, and that establishes the inner boundary of this pad foot. Now this pad foot has just got a couple of little fillets. I'm just going to draw these in by hand, top and bottom. And those are connected by a torus. just lay in the shadow lines for that fillet so it shows up. We've also just established a pretty important point here. The edge of that fillet and the edge of this molding where it meets the foot is an important reference line for drawing in an OG curve. So we're going to connect those two. And actually it's not too difficult to draw freehand. Once you have that line established, just find the midpoint and mark that, and I'll just lay in my OG curve from here to here using that midpoint as a reference. Just kind of freehand this in here. We've got another point that's fairly important to establish. I've got a apex where an OG curve comes together and then it goes up and curves back into this leg. And that is another simple proportion between the envelope from where my pad ends and where the form ends. I divide it by 5 and I'm laying in a little reference mark. And actually it's 2/5 of the way across and it's halfway between the pad and where the base meets the molding. So I'm just going to kind of just eyeball this thing about halfway there. And there's my apex that I'm shooting for. Now that I've got that reference point in here, I'm just going to freehand in a little OG curve back to where the base terminates. And I'm also going to use, with my eye, kind of match this OG curve over here. And I'm just going to bring up and around here. There's my curve. The only thing left to finish on this is the ovolo on the molding that goes from the case to the base. And it's got a couple of fillets, which are simply little squares. And I'm going to draw in. And then my ovolo. We'll draw in our shadow lines. And now finally let's put in a little reveal here to get the drawers up off the molding. And this base is complete. Now let's turn again to the studio piece. The foot for this is designed along many of the same proportions, but has a very different look. I'll start with pulling off a few of those punctuation lines that we put earlier, where you divide by a 1/6 to establish your molding at the top. And I'm also going to grab that top of that pad foot, that dividing by a 1/5, to establish a pad on the bottom. Now, for this molding on the top, I'm going to repeat what I did on the top of the case. I'm just going to lay a little curve on here. Just freehand this. Nice and simple. And as you remember, the foot extended out 1/3 of a square on the other side. Well, we're going to do the same thing here. We're going to extend this out 1/3 of a square. That'll tell us the outer boundary of this. We're going to put a little pad on this also. So that's the outer boundary of it. And we're going to make it the same width as the pad on the other side. That's the inner boundary of it. I'm actually going to just take this straight up. For this side of it, I'm going to again repeat that little curve that we've got all through the piece. It's kind of nice to repeat elements like that. Now I'm just going to take and connect these up with a nice sweeping curve from this pad to this molding. And then we're going to do the same thing up here. Finally, let's lay the reveal line in here so our drawers aren't bumping the molding. And that foot is complete. I laid in a couple of elements on both sides of the piece to emphasize verticality. Over here on the studio side, I just used a simple chamfer. The width of it is half the width of the side. I also use the width of the side to determine where to start the chamfer on both the top and the bottom. I use that same dimension over on the traditional side to tell me where to start my base for a fluted quarter column. The difference proportionally in this is that it takes up 3/4 of the width of this side. But they both do the same thing. They emphasize the verticality of the piece. Now all that's left is to fill in the case with drawers. On both sides, we're going to lay in graduated drawers. By graduated drawers, I mean each drawer, as it goes up, will be shorter than the one below it. And in traditional work, generally they make the drawer shorter by the width of one drawer divider as it goes up the case. Designers did this so the design wouldn't be static, but rather it would draw your eye up. Now you've got a couple of choices on a small bureau like this. Typically you're going to put 3 or 4 drawers in. If you try to put 2 in, the drawers are going to be so deep they're going to be sort of like a toy box you have to rummage around. And if you try to go with 5 drawers, the top drawer will be so narrow that it'll be more like a tray than a drawer. So we're going to lay in a 3-drawer graduated set on this traditional side. Then over here on the studio side, we're going to lay in a 4-drawer graduated set. Now all you need to know to lay in graduated drawers is actually the width of your drawer dividers. In this case, it's going to be about 7/8 of an inch. So I'll carefully set one set of dividers to that 7/8 inch width. And I'm going to come over to my drawer opening on this traditional side where we're going to lay in 3 drawers, and I'm going to walk down 5 spaces. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I'm going to make an indentation mark here so I can come back and see it, or you could make a pencil mark. From there, I'm going to come back with another set of dividers. And since I'm putting 3 drawers in this side, I'm going to divide this into 3 equal spaces. So starting at that indentation mark, I'm going to come down 3 times. 1, 2, 3. And I'm off a little bit, so we'll just pull these dividers in. This is kind of a trial and error thing. So I'll come back here. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, that's pretty close. Now, that gives me the width of my top drawer. So I'm going to bring this up to my drawer opening and my T-square up to here. And that establishes my first drawer. Now I've already got the width of this divider set here, so I can lay in that first divider. Now the next drawer has a divider in it, and then that drawer unit. There's my next drawer. Now I'll lay in my final divider. Now we've just laid in 3 graduated drawers. Now you might ask yourself, why did I start out going down 5 spaces on that first sequence? Well, the reason is this second drawer and this third drawer have a drawer divider widths built into them. This one has 1, and this bottom drawer has 2, since each drawer has an extra divider width built into the height of it. So if you count them up, it's 1, 2 actual dividers, then there's 1 built into this, that's 3, and then finally this bottom drawer has 2 more, 4 and 5. That's those first 5 units that I marked off down here. And basically what I was trying to find out is, what is the space that I'm going to take up with drawer dividers, divide the remaining space by 3, and that'll give me this top unit that I can use to start with. We'll go over to the other side and we'll lay in a 4-drawer unit. It's basically the same routine, except for on a 4-drawer side, we're going to start up here at the top of the opening and we're going to come down 9 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Make a little indentation there so I know where a reference to start. Now I'll take my compass. Since I'm putting 4 drawers in, I'm going to divide this into 4 equal spaces. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'll just have to adjust the compass until we get this. It might take a try or two. 1, 2, 3, 4. One more time, that should do it. 1, 2, 3, 4. Pretty well nailed it. Now I've got my top drawer opening. I come up here to the top of the opening. Here's my first drawer. Set my first divider. My second drawer, it's the width of 1 divider plus this drawer opening. Let's put another divider in here. Now finally, for this drawer, we're going to go with 2 more. And our final drawer divider. That's complete. And just to review again, I counted down 9 spaces before I started dividing up my opening. And the reason is there's 9 drawer dividers built into this arrangement. We've got 3 actual ones, 1, 2, 3. Then there's another one built into here, that's 4. 2 more into here, 5, 6. And then finally the bottom one has 3 built into it, 7, 8, and 9. That's the routine for drawing 4 graduated drawers. We finished our drawing, and I've cleaned it up a bit, and here we have the completed piece. The traditional on one side and the studio piece over on the other. 2 completely different looks, but based on the same proportional schemes. There's still a lot of options. For this studio piece, we could use some nice mahogany for the sides, top, and feet. And we could contrast that with some beautiful blistered maple drawer fronts. And maybe we'll take some cocobolo and make some little pulls to contrast again for drawer pulls. On this traditional side, more than likely it's going to be made out of 1 wood. Let's use some walnut. We can use some crotch walnut drawer fronts, cap that off with some beading, and then we can use some traditional brasses. So here we have it, 2 designs based on the same proportional scheme. We've explored the use of proportions to roughen a form, and the classic orders to organize individual elements within a form. This should give you a whole new perspective. As you process this knowledge, you will begin to see furniture differently. That's a good thing. It's a sure sign that your eye for design is developing. You'll begin to understand more of what you see and tackle design problems with confidence. I encourage you to begin applying these to your own designs.